The storms are worsening, the fires are growing, and the temperatures are rising. On Earth Day 2021, the US told the world that they're back and ready to be a leader in the global effort to clean our climate and protect our nature. But the rest of the world has questions. Is it for real? For the US to be a leader, there are areas where they'll have to play catch-up. And there are other areas where the US is poised to make a dramatic impact and influence the world. But what are those areas? Let's find out on the road to Glasgow. The global climate is changing. As more carbon is emitted into the atmosphere, temperatures rise, ice caps melt, storms increase, and wildfires burn. But this isn't something that has just happened this year or last. It's something the world came together to look at almost 50 years ago in the early 70s. Out of that new realization of the damage being done, countries like the US began to clean up. A little. Several key legislation acts were passed, and there were some improvements, but not nearly enough. And the world leaders got together in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit to finally get serious about protecting our climate. From that summit, the United Nations called a Conference of the Parties, a COP, in 1995. And every year the COP meets in a different country. The famous Kyoto Protocol came out of COP3 in 1997, but eventually that protocol failed, especially when the US pulled out. The reason was the protocol had selected developed countries paying the price for reducing emissions, but other countries with big carbon problems did not have to change. Every year, the countries gathered to talk about the impending crisis, and every year, little or nothing was actually done. Then came the Paris Agreement in 2015 at COP21. Finally, the world came together with clear goals and a general idea on how to implement. You see, the threat to climate has been seen as the rise in global temperatures. The goal? Keep the temperature from rising 2.5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels and further limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. The first big milestone, report card if you will, was to be 5 years after, at COP26, which was going to be held in Glasgow, Scotland in 2020. Well, that didn't happen with the global pandemic. So COP26 was moved to November of 2021, and we are looking at the conferences and summits leading up to this extremely important COP to see if real change is happening and is going to continue to happen. In our last episode, we visited with renowned conservationist Harvey Locke and his Global Goals for Climate and Nature virtual conference about how the world has been focused intently on carbon emissions while mostly ignoring the damage done to nature, that climate and nature are linked together, and the answer to our world's problems will be found in a comprehensive approach. Since that conference, well, on Earth Day 2021, the newly sworn-in US President Joe Biden held a virtual conference with world leaders called the Leaders Summit on Climate. One of Biden's leaders in this effort is Gina McCarthy, former head of the EPA under Obama, and the new created position of National Climate Advisor to the President.
It's great to be here. Happy Earth Day. On day one, President Biden fulfilled his promise to rejoin the Paris Agreement. And as part of re-entering the Paris Agreement, the President launched a whole-of-government process that was organized through his climate task force to establish the 2030 emissions target, which is known as the Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC. And it's a formal submission to the United Nations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
The National Determined Contribution, or NDC, is a term that is in the Paris Agreement. It is the commitment of a country to outline and communicate their post-2020 climate goals. It's the action that we are looking for from each country. Gina McCarthy and the Biden administration used the summit to announce the US's NDC.
Our NDC basically says that the United States will reduce our net economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. And this target builds on U.S. leadership at all levels of government and programs to date and positions American workers in industry to help us tackle the climate crisis.
What's clear to me as I look for real action that will make a difference in the climate in the near future is that this new US administration is taking head-on the opposition stand, that carbon reduction will be a huge hit to the country's economy. The Biden team has repeatedly linked carbon reduction with job creation.
That's why when people talk about climate, I think jobs. Within our climate response lies an extraordinary engine of job creation and economic opportunity ready to be fired up. That's why I've proposed a huge investment in American infrastructure and American innovation to tap the economic opportunity that climate change presents our workers and our communities, especially those too often that have left out and left behind.
Is it for real? Can a country dramatically reduce carbon while at the same time increasing jobs? I wanted to find out more, so I sat down with US Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat, Rhode Island.
The whole economy grows when you have cleaner, less expensive, more reliable energy. Plus, you have all the jobs building that cleaner, more reliable, less expensive energy. Plus, you have the lift of the things that aren't ruined. So if you're a fisherman, in Rhode Island we have a very significant fishing community. Really hard to find any lobster these days because the ocean warmed and the lobsters moved north, and you get species moving around, so you find people who can't do their livelihood any longer. If you can stop climate change, there's less of that harm. So between the economic lift to the economy generally and all the transition jobs and the stuff that you protect from people not losing their jobs from climate disasters, it, I think, portends a time of really significant economic growth.
While here in Washington, D.C., I met with several climate activists and specialists to get their take on Biden's Leaders Summit on climate. Is the US's position on reducing carbon enough, or is there more that needs to be done?
The first most important outcome was just the return of the United States to the international negotiating table, to the international discussion around climate solutions.
What do you think was missing?
Well, what we're still missing is a pathway globally and within our country to meeting our targets in the short term, and then also meeting those long-term targets towards reaching net zero emissions by mid-century. And so it was an important first step to have the United States rejoin the international conversations. But now we as a country need to adopt policies to send ourselves on a pathway to meet our new targets and to set a pathway to start heading towards net zero emissions by mid-century.
I think the Leaders Summit on climate went well. I think you got increasing ambition from the United States and from other countries around the world. I think that what was missing was ambition is great, but you need action to back up that ambition. And so, a lot of goals. I don't see yet how we're going to meet those goals, and that's what I'm looking for moving forward.
There's a great analogy that climate is like a bathtub, right? We've got 1 trillion tons of greenhouse gases in the bathtub today, and we're adding 50 billion more tons every year. So we can't just focus on reducing the faucet flow, right? We have to open the drain. No, I don't think it's enough to focus on reducing emissions. We have to figure out how to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And luckily, I think there are technologies that we can point to that do so, and they're increasingly becoming more financeable, more scalable, more viable as a way to get carbon out of the atmosphere.
The specialists agreed it was a fine first step, but that action was needed specifically an emphasis on reduction, a new message on restoration. Will legislation be enough to bring about real change in the US climate effort? Or will it face the inevitable pendulum swing as political winds blow back and forth in this country? Let's find out when we come back on the road to Glasgow. On April 22nd, 2021, United States President Joe Biden held a leaders' summit on climate. While Biden has tasked Gina McCarthy with domestic climate issues and strategies, it fell to John Kerry to carry the message to the rest of the world, who, understandably, have many questions and even doubts about the United States' efforts on serious climate action.
We need to bring all the countries of the world to the table, and we all need to raise ambition. That's the central theme of this meeting today. We must all raise ambition.
Well, the rest of the world understands that this new US administration is taking quick steps, but one of the first questions Kerry was asked was how the US could maintain consistent action through various and differing political changes in the country. Can real change occur if the Democrats and Republicans can't come together? Can the United States enact real change simply through executive orders and not legislation?
A lot of the plan is executable through order. But that's the power of having the private sector here. That is the real reason why I'm saying to you that no politician in the future is going to do this, because all over the world, trillions of dollars, trillions of yen, trillions of euros are going to be heading into this new marketplace. And the future belongs to the countries, as you heard today from any number of leaders, that are the ones who develop hydrogen, green hydrogen fuel, or storage, or battery storage, or direct carbon capture from the atmosphere.
For the United States, is real change in climate action going to be led by businesses, or will it require a legislative approach? John Kerry talked about the key to a climate strategy weathering the political winds was for commerce to step up. But is that realistic? I searched Washington, D.C. for experts to get their thoughts on whether lasting change can occur in industry alone, or if it will also require legislative action.
I think the private sector has a very important role to play in American politics. Certainly the private sector is a source of a lot of solutions, but the private sector also needs Congress. They need the political environment to help them help us. And so I'm really looking for, again, action. I'm looking for Congress to act to help give the private sector what they need, the signals they need, so they can both honor their shareholders, their responsibility to earn money, while also responding to the global need to address climate.
I think it's great that companies like Shopify and Stripe and Microsoft have made bold commitments to getting to zero, getting past zero, and really promoting carbon removal as part of the equation. I don't believe, given the scale of what we're talking about, it is ever fair to suggest that the private sector can do it alone. We are talking about a breathtaking change in how we live, how we make things, how we heat our homes, how we build. Absolutely everything about our lives has to change in 30 years. Luckily, COVID has shown us what's possible when it comes to really mobilized action. I mean, here we had this global pandemic. The world had never created an effective vaccine in less than 4 years, and we did it in less than a year, right? Not just one company created a vaccine, but several companies around the world did. What I think it's shown is when you align the interests and you get the government moving and you get innovators moving, a lot can transform in a short amount of time. But no, it can't just lie on the private sector. It's going to take action, not only from the private sector, but particularly government. So I would respectfully disagree that that's enough.
And if we're going to have a policy pathway to meet our climate goals, we're going to need bipartisanship around this issue.
Speaking of bipartisanship, you recently co-authored an opinion piece in the Washington Post with James Baker. What was that like, working with an icon of the Republican Party?
anyone anywhere would be hard-pressed to find a smarter, more strategic political thinker than former Secretary of State James Baker. And the case that Secretary Baker and I made in our recent piece in the Washington Post is we have this opportunity to outmaneuver our biggest economic rivals, including countries like China and Russia, and it exists in the climate policy space. And US leadership has the ability to position the United States in an incredibly strong strategic position internationally. And it also has the ability, with a market-based system, with a price on carbon, and applying that same fee on imports from China and elsewhere, to drive our economic benefits here in the United States. That's the kind of strategic thinking that James Baker is calling for. He's asking our lawmakers, he's telling our lawmakers, if you want to win, if we're really serious about winning in the 21st century from an economic standpoint, there's no better place to lead than on climate.
It seems like to me it's going to require both industry and legislation in order to be able to see real change and not just executive orders by the sitting US president. It's going to take bipartisanship. It's not enough for this president to decree to his nation and to the world what the US is going to do. It's going to take the people of the country to follow through. That's what I'm taking away from the Leaders in Climate Summit. When we come back, let's find out what was noticeably missing from the summit. As we are on the road to Glasgow, the important thing about these conferences and summits leading up to COP26 are often the things left out, the things not said. I put this question to some of the people and specialists I've met here in Washington, DC. Here's what they had to say.
The US needs to adopt policies to send ourselves on a trajectory towards meeting our new targets, to send ourselves on a trajectory towards meeting net zero emissions by mid-century. And the single best way to do that is to establish an economy-wide price on carbon. Pricing carbon is nearly universally understood among the international community as the most effective way to lower emissions.
You've seen lots of statements for a carbon price explicitly, even interestingly, the American Petroleum Institute, very circumscribed, but they called for a carbon price. And I think that these increasing calls from the private sector are a way of putting pressure on Congress to act. And in this instance, that is what the science and what the economics says is the single best step that we can take. So here you really do see the private sector aligning with what the science and economics says. They are raising their voice in a way that is helpful to Congress. I would like to see them directly speak to Congress and say, not only are we issuing this statement, but we mean it.
Carbon pricing is changing the landscape. Many countries already have a carbon pricing program in place. And here's the interesting thing. Some believe the US would actually be at a huge advantage over most of the rest of the world if they implemented carbon pricing. Greg Bertelsen explains.
Here's the real benefit to the United States in the short term, along with becoming a leader on climate action, is we're going to create a competitive advantage for our US companies because we have already made the investments to ensure that our economy is more efficient, meaning we can make the same or similar products as our competitors in China and elsewhere while emitting less carbon. Now that is a wonderful environmental story for our country, but we should be leveraging that to our economic advantage to benefit our companies, our manufacturers, our workers. And if we priced carbon and assess that fee at the border, the same price based on the emissions that are coming from China and elsewhere, we're going to instantly give a competitive advantage to our manufacturers and our workers. We did a study recently which showed the US steel industry as just one example. If we were to price carbon, because the US steel industry is of the most carbon efficient in the world, meaning we can make a ton of steel while emitting less carbon than almost anywhere in the rest of the world. If we were to price carbon and then assess that same fee at the border, our manufacturers would win across the board in every region of our country. We would max out capacity, which means more jobs. We would increase profit. We would increase revenue. We would win, but we've got to be strategic.
For the US to be taken seriously about climate action on the global stage, a carbon price needs to be enacted. And as we talked about earlier, it will take legislation, not just executive orders. But what legislation is the US pursuing? I had a wee chat with Senator Whitehouse to find out if the US can pass legislation and what it would look like.
It puts a price on carbon emissions. It starts at a little over $50 per ton of emitted carbon, and then it accelerates above that. It is modeled at this point, just on its own, to reduce our carbon emissions 50%. So if you take a measure like that and you put it in, along with the electric vehicle measure that the Biden administration wants, along with the clean electricity standard that they want, along with a suite of other investments that will help move this forward, you can get a very, very strong result in terms of carbon reductions.
Time is running short, and the Conference of the Parties is fast approaching in Glasgow in November. I want to know what is realistic to expect to come out of the conferences leading up, and more importantly, what to expect to come out of COP26.
What I hope comes out of the coming COP is, yes, I want to see ambition, but I want to see ambition backed by action. I want to see not just goals and statements of what can happen, but I want to see a plan for how are we going to get our respective governing bodies here in the United States, Congress, parliaments in other countries, whatever it is, what are they going to do to act? Here in the United States, anything that a president can do without Congress, the next president can undo without Congress. And so durability really becomes a concern for executive action.
Our last best hope is only a few months ahead. The road to Glasgow is a road to not just carbon reduction, but climate restoration. Will it be a summer of talk or an autumn of action? Our next stop in the road to Glasgow will be the south of France for the IUCN World Conservation Congress in September of 2021. Please come along with me as we find out what works, what doesn't, and what might happen on the road to Glasgow.